Is this finally the version of Green Lantern that we've been waiting for? What if the best Green Lantern story isn't actually about Green Lantern? Because on paper, Lantern sounds like the weirdest possible adaptation. Toon Green Lanterns, an alien murder, a small town in Nebraska, and a mystery that looks more like a true detective than a superhero show. But here's the thing. The more I watch, the more I realize this might actually be one of the most comic accurate Green Lantern adaptations we've ever gotten. Not because it copies the comic panel per panel, it's because it understands what makes these characters work so well. Hal Jordan and John Sterwart, Centros, the Green Lantern Corps, the Guardians, it all just works so well. The Manhunters, and the idea that underneath all this cosmic mythology, Green Lanterns has always been about cops investigating things that are much bigger than they understand. And after the first couple episodes, I'm starting to think DC may have finally figured out how to make Green Lantern work on screen. So what is Lanterns exactly? Let's start with what this show exactly is. Lanterns follows Hal Jordan and John Sterwart. Hal is a veteran, John is a rookie, and instead of immediately sending them across the galaxy, the show drops them into Rushville, Nebraska. There's a murder, there's an alien connection, and the two Lanterns have to figure out what happened. It's basically a buddy cop mystery, except the cops have glowing green rings. I honestly think that this was a brilliant way to introduce Green Lantern into the DC universe, because Green Lantern has always been a police force. The Green Lantern Corps is essentially an intergalactic law enforcement organization. Each Lantern is assigned to a sector of space. Hal Jordan is Earth's most famous Lantern, John Sterwart is another member of the Corps, and now they're partners, except they don't exactly like each other, and John needs to learn under Hal. He's his apprentice for the most part, in case Hal can no longer do the job. Let's dive into who Hal is. Kyle Chandler's Hal Jordan is probably the biggest departure from the version of Hal we've seen before. This isn't the cocky young test pilot we've seen in previous adaptations. He's older, he's experienced, and he's tired. And he's starting to realize that his time as a Lantern may be coming to an end, which makes this relationship with John that much more interesting, because Hal isn't just training a new Lantern, he's looking at the person who eventually might replace him. And that gives a relationship an underlining tension that helps the show's pacing. Hal knows what the job costs, but John doesn't, at least not yet, and that's very much in line with the comics. Hal Jordan has always been defined by fearlessness, recklessness, and willpower. The entire Green Lantern mythology revolves around the idea that the ring chooses people capable of overcoming fear. The power isn't really the ring, it's the person wearing it. DC's own character description emphasizes Hal's ability to create hard light constructs, fly, create force fields, and use the ring's alien technology. And the show gets something important right. Hal isn't interesting because he's powerful. He's interesting because he's afraid of what happens when he isn't. Then we get John Sterwart. John is one of the most important Green Lanterns in DC history. He first appeared in Green Lantern number 87 in 1971, and his original introduction was tied directly to Hal Jordan. So I love that they kept that. In the famous hard-traveling heroes era, Hal encounters John while working with Green Arrow. The story is especially relevant because DC itself has identified hard-traveling heroes as one of the comics worth reading before watching Lanterns, specifically because it features John's first appearance and puts him in very different relationship with Hal. The HBO show obviously isn't recreating that story, but it's taking the basic relationship. Veteran Lantern plus a new recruit. Let's rebuild it, and I actually like that. John isn't being treated like Hal Jordan's sidekick, he's being treated like his successor. And there's a lot of humor to this sidekick thing that you can tell bothers John. John Sterwart has always been one of the most disciplined members of the Corps. He's a Marine, he's an architect, he's someone who thinks before he acts. Hal lives off instinct. John is structure, Hal jumps. John measures the distance. To me, that's a great pairing distance. That's going to have a good chemistry and banter. One of the things that I appreciate about Lanterns is that it doesn't treat the Green Lantern ring like a generic superhero gadget. The ring is basically a weapon powered by willpower. It can create constructs, weapons, vehicles, shields, flight, pretty much anything the wearer can imagine. But the comics have always placed limitations around the power. The ring needs to be charged. The Lanterns need to have the willpower to use it. I like the way that they introduced the charge thing in the first episode with the alien saying, "Aren't you running out of power, Hal?" It's like a nice subtle way without just throwing it in your face. That's why one of the most interesting moments in the series involves John creating something that appears to exist beyond the normal limitations of the ring, a green bird. And then he can seemingly maintain it even after the ring is gone. That's not something that the show casually explains, and that makes it important because the show is already asking, is there something different about John Sterwart? And if you're familiar with the comics, That's exactly what kind of question the show should be asking. Then we get Sinestro. And this is where the show starts flexing. Sinestro is one of the most important villains in Green Lantern history. But what's important is that he isn't originally the villain. In fact, he was one of the greatest Green Lanterns. He was Hal Jordan's mentor, and eventually his beliefs about order and control turned him against the Corps. That's why the relationship between Hal and Sinestro is so important. Sinestro doesn't think he's evil, he thinks he's right. He believes that people need to be controlled. Hal believes they need to be freed, and John is stuck between them. That psychological conflict is one of the core ideas of Green Lantern's comics, and Lanterns is already using Sinestro in a really interesting way. He's not just the bad guy, he's someone who understands Hal better than Hal understands himself. And to me, my friends, that's much closer to the comics. DC's own history of the Sinestro's Corps describes Sinestro as a former Green Lantern who eventually turns against the Corps and uses his fear as a weapon of his own army. So when Sinestro appears, the show isn't already introducing a villain, it's introducing the history of Hal Jordan. And then there's the weirdest piece of the entire mystery, the Manhunters. If you're a casual Green Lantern fan, you might be wondering, what the hell is a Manhunter? They're not Martian Manhunters, completely different thing. The Manhunters are ancient robotic enforcers created by the Guardians before the Green Lantern Corps. Think of them as the Guardians' first attempt of creating an intergalactic police force, and it went badly. They eventually rebelled, and their history is deeply connected to the origins of the Green Lantern Corps. The comics established the Manhunters as an early form of cosmic law enforcement created by the Guardians before the Corps. So hiring them into the Lanterns isn't some random deep cut reference. It's actually a pretty important piece of Green Lantern mythology. And the show is using them as a mystery underneath the mystery. We think we're investigating a murder, then we discover aliens, then we discover the Manhunters, and suddenly this tiny Nebraska town is connected to the entire history of the Green Lantern Corps. That's the classic Green Lantern. And this is probably my biggest takeaway. People are going to see lanterns and be like, this doesn't look like Green Lanterns. And I understand why. It's dark, it's grounded, it's rural, there's a murder mystery, there are giant space battles every 5 minutes. That's not necessarily unfaithful. You gotta remember that the show is pulling from multiple eras of the Green Lantern comics. Hard traveling heroes give us Hal and John. Secret Origin gives us Hal's modern origin and the mythology surrounding him. John Stewart's Secret Origin story connects him to the Manhunter. Green Lantern Rebirth established much of the modern mythology surrounding Hal and the Sinestros and the Corps. And the show's creators have clearly been digging into that material. DC itself recommended those exact stories as a reading list before watching Lanterns, so no. This isn't a direct adaptation, but it's mythology accurate, and I think that's more important. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, True Detective, because Lantern absolutely looks like it's borrowing from it. Two detectives, a strange murder, rural settings, secrets everywhere, everybody has something to hide, but here's why I think it works. Green Lantern has always been a detective story. The difference is the crime scene can be an entire planet. The suspect can be an alien, and the evidence can be a piece of technology that's older than human civilization. So making the first major DCU Green Lantern story a direct mystery actually makes sense to me. It gives the audience a way into an enormous mythology instead of saying, here's Guardians, here's 50 alien races, here's the emotional spectrum, good luck figuring it out. The show says, there's been a murder, okay, let's solve it, and then slowly the universe just gets bigger, and to me that's smart storytelling. The biggest thing that Lantern gets right is it doesn't make the Ring the main character. Don't get me wrong, the rings are cool, the constructs are cool, the aliens are cool, but none of this matters if Hal and John aren't interesting, and so far their chemistry and banter together is very interesting, and them as people are interesting. To me, that's where the show is the strongest. Hal is a man realizing he's getting older. John is a man trying to figure out what kind of Lantern he wants to become. Sinestros is a man who believes the entire system is broken, and underneath all of them is one question. What does it exactly mean to have power? That's Green Lantern. Not the color green, not the CGI, not the ring, it's willpower. And this is where I'm excited, because if this show is willing to go this deep in the Green Lantern mythology this early, there's a lot of places this could go. The Guardians, Oa, the Green Lantern Corps, the Manhunters, Sinstro, the Emotional Spectrum, and eventually the Yellow Lanterns. Because if Sinstros is here, you have to wonder how far away we are from the Sinstros Corps. And if that happens, we're no longer talking about a murder mystery in Nebraska. We're talking about an intergalactic war, but the show is smart enough to not stay there. It starts small, and that's exactly what the comics have always done. Give us a character, give us a problem, then reveal the universe around them. So, is Lantern comic accurate? I think so, but probably not the way that people expected. It's not recreating one specific Green Lantern comic. It's doing something arguably smarter. It's taking the DNA of the comics, Hal Jordan, John Sterwart, Sinstros, the Corps, the Guardians, the Manhunter, the Rings, the detective work, the idea of willpower versus fear, and it's putting all of that inside a grounded mystery. And honestly, I think that's exactly what Green Lantern needed to work. Because we've already seen what happens when you try to make Green Lantern into a giant CGI superhero movie. Ryan Reynolds regretted it. This feels different. It feels like DC is finally asking, what if we just made like a really good Green Lantern story and then let the universe get weird? Because right now we're in Nebraska, we're investigating a murder, but somewhere out there, there's a planet called Oa, or OA, and there's a Guardian watching. There are thousands of Green Lanterns across the universe, and something called the Manhunter has come back. So the murder might be the smallest part of this story, and if the Lanterns can pull it off, we might finally be getting the Green Lantern adaptation we've been wanting for so long.